are good things. So a brief overview. The chapter was actually broken into several subsections. The first one was China Syndrome, then it was Honk If You Love Global Warming, Honk If You Like Dick Cheney, of Science and Political Science, Hot and Flat and Crowded, Hungry, Thirsty, and Unstable. And then we'll conclude it at the end. So the beginning of China Syndrome starts with a movie that was actually titled The China Syndrome, starring Jane Fonda and Michael Douglas in 1979. And it starts out by Jane Fonda is actually a news reporter, and her cameraman is Michael Douglas, and they're inside a control room of a nuclear facility. And all of a sudden the building shakes, and it's kind of mass chaos. And actually, the coolant level in covering one of the cores actually dropped below it, and it ended up just causing mass hysteria in the movie. I haven't actually seen it, but this is what the book said. And but they got everything under control, and it kind of flew under the radar. Well, actually, 12 days after the premiere of the movie is when the 3 Mile Island Unit 2, the coolant level actually dropped to where it was only covering half the reactor core, and according to the book, reached temperatures up to 5,200 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty warm. And then just a couple other things. The title behind the China Syndrome was saying that the core would get so hot that it would actually melt all the way down to China. But that was just kind of interesting fact. It's been over 30 years since the NRC, actually the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, approved construction on any nuclear power plant in the U.S., and that was actually Watts Bar here in Tennessee. And nuclear power accounts for 20% of the power production in the U.S. So the next little subsection was Honk If You Love Global Warming. The whole section pretty much talked about how burning fossil fuels increase the greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere, and pretty much said since the Industrial Revolution, the CO2 in the atmosphere went from 280 parts per million to 390 parts per million, which is a significant increase. And then the global warming trend, the author said it tends to magnify climate characteristics. So he was saying the areas that would get a lot of snowfall, the snowfall actually increased. The drier climates became more drier, suffering severe droughts. And the areas such as the coast that tend to get hurricanes, actually the number of hurricanes increased over time. So the next section was Honk If You Like Dick Cheney. And there was a report that came out about the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, saying that the scientists in the Middle East were actually selling information to Al-Qaeda, and that it could potentially be a big risk. And he was saying that the probability of an actual nuclear attack happening is low, but if it did ended up occurring, it's a really high impact event that would affect almost everyone around the globe. So he kind of related that to global warming in this section, saying that right now we can't see the actual effects of global warming, but over time it has shown to increase. I believe it said over the last 40 years it increased from 0.08 degrees Celsius per decade to actually 0.39 degrees Celsius per decade, which was a large increase over the past few years. It also broke down one thing that the military was that 1 in every 24 convoys that are traveling, carrying fuel and water to the different bases throughout Iraq and Afghanistan, one person gets injured by, say, an IED or explosive. And by switching to alternative fuels, saying have solar panels or wind technology, that could actually supply some power that would reduce the need for fuel convoys and could eventually save lives. And by having that alternative fuel for the soldiers would reduce the amount bought from the Middle East and could reduce the money going to the terrorists. Is pretty much how it broke down. So the next thing was of science and political science. It talked about the Clean Air Act and how the government limited the amount of pollution that industry could actually put out and set a bar. And every year, every few years, it's amended to where they actually reduce the amount of pollution that companies could put out, and that way they could strive to have cleaner emissions throughout making power. It also mentioned natural gas in the United States, how using the technique of fracking is able to really get out natural gas from the deep foundations within the earth, and that the natural gas power plants could produce half the CO2 emissions as a coal plant would actually use. And then the hot, flat, and crowded, hungry, thirsty, and unstable talked about how the increase in fuel costs and the dependency on natural resources, as those prices increase, so do the fuel prices around the world, and it's making it more difficult for different countries that are struggling, developing, to have the money for food. And then it also broke down how California is improving the home efficiency, and they're making stricter regulations on insulation companies and things like that, just to improve home efficiency and use less power, which means that you burn less fuel. And they're trying to make a switch. And when California began doing this, then the government met with the car manufacturers and started regulating how to improve gas mileage in vehicles so that over time they use less fossil fuels. And so now there's been acts to make sure that car manufacturers are improving gas mileage continuously over into the future, and so improving energy usage could clean up the atmosphere and help. So in conclusion, making more efficient energy production in power plants and also with vehicles produces less greenhouse gas emissions, and it also makes a lower dependence on the oil that's actually being brought in from the Middle East, and reduces the risk money going to terrorism and different terroristic groups. And then new technology innovations can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's pretty much what the whole book, or the whole chapter 10 was all about.
I'll be doing a presentation on Chapter 12. Whatever it is, I'm against it. The basic overview of this chapter was broken into several different sections, starting with the Great Disjunction, The Way We Were, A Broken System, Mount Rushmore, Meet Me in the Lobby, Show Me the Money, Media Madness, and California, Here We Come. With the Great Disjunction, he talked about polarized America is a myth. Basically, the representative government in America today does not accurately represent Americans. Then it went on to show FIOR, which is a political scientist from Stanford who did a study that showed that there is no cultural war in the U.S. for most people, and that many of the activists, politicians, and political parties and various groups hate each other and think to be at war, but in reality, that's very little of America. 80 to 90% of Americans do not feel this way, and this causes there to be swing voters. Then there was the CBS story titled Polarization in America that showed that 76% of Republicans, 87% of Democrats, 86% of independents wanted their elected officials to compromise rather than to stick to their specific principles. And then the Rush-Marshall poll that was taken in October 2010 showed that 43% of people believe that Democrats and Republicans are not a party for the American people. Then we went back to the way that we were and the baby boom generation. In that time, we had basic 4 different parties: the regular Democrats and Republicans, along with the Dixiecrats that were Democrats that were but conservative Southerners, and then the Rockefeller Republicans that had liberal social views but conservative economic terms. Then we go into safe districts, which is when a candidate basically has a sure win in that district. Jeff Reischer stated that talked about the adjusting of the lines of the district due to population, but this becomes a problem because politicians have a hand in it, causing it easier for them to gain those safe districts, and the people in the middle get turned off and end up not voting. Next, we have a broken system. On May 19th, 1856, a fight broke out on the Senate floor between Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, who's a Republican, giving a speech on anti-slavery. He was attacked by Preston Brock, a Democrat at that point in time. Within a few years after that attack, there was a civil war. That wasn't a very good way to show how our nation should be ran, obviously, because the entire nation followed. Then there's debate about negative campaigning, where the Washington Post on April 20th, 2012, says that negative campaigning energizes their own political base, and it prevents undecided moderates in the middle from getting affected by the election, and they don't vote. And Francis Fukuyama was a Stanford professor that wrote The End of History and The Last Man. Basically states that Americans generally think about constraining the government and limiting the scope. And finally, Mike Murphy, a veteran Republican, probably said it the best way. If we don't save the store, the question between the center right and center left, between apples and oranges, will be irrelevant. We'll all be working at TGI Fridays in Beijing. Basically saying that if we don't fix our government, we're going to be owned by China, and we're going to be screwed. Then we have Mount Rushmore that has 2 famous presidents on it that he speaks about: Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was a Democrat, and then Ronald Reagan, who was a Republican. He states that these both established the core agendas for their political parties. The Democratic Party having a priority of preservation and expansion of federal and social welfare groups, while the Republicans want a reduction for taxes. Then we have Meet Me in the Lobby, which is talking about lobbyists. The term lobbyist first came about in the 1870s when people waited in the Willard Hotel for President Grant to try to get him to go which way or the other. But it's greatly changed since then, because in 2010, there were 1,900 firms that employed 11,000 lobbyists, paid at $3.5 billion apiece to sway the votes of the people that have been elected.